Hello and welcome to the Avrum Rosensweig Show.
Welcome to one of the internet's best podcasts, where we dive deep into the lives of the extraordinary and fascinating people who leave an indelible mark on our world. Join us as we explore their captivating stories, remarkable achievements, and unique perspectives that shape history and inspire generations. Get ready to embark on a journey through the lives of inspiring people unlike any other.
Hello, folks, and welcome to the show. My name is indeed Avrum Rosensweig, and I remind everybody that the reason why I do this podcast and have for a while now is to remind people of the beauty that exists in our world. And I do that through inspirational interviews. Today, we're talking about journalism to a very well-known journalist. And I just want to give you a little bit of background, give you some context on journalism itself. While life can be cloudy, as it is to a great extent today, the legacy of journalists and journalism to date illuminates our surroundings. Starting way back in ancient civilization in Rome, acta diurna, public records or daily acts, were posted in public places, reporting on government activities and events. Later in medieval periods, written communication was often used by the church and monarchs to control information. Town criers and handwritten manuscripts were used to relay news, but literacy was limited and news spread slowly. Moving forward to the 18th century, the emergence of newspapers that were financially independent from the state, such as the Daily Courant in 1702 in England, marked the growth of commercial journalism. This period also saw the beginning of the editorial structure, where opinions could be expressed in public forums. Throughout the 18th century, thinkers like John Milton, Thomas Paine, Voltaire advocated for freedom of speech and press, laying the groundwork for modern journalism. The early American colonies also saw the importance of free press, especially with the role of newspapers during the American Revolution. In the 20th century, investigative journalism was launched together with news on radio and television. As times continued, digital news evolved and journalists found themselves on the big screen and the tiny little screen. Today, journalists are still cranking out news, but so are regular folks. My guest today is David Horovitz, born in Britain, is the founding editor of the Times of Israel. He is the author of Still Life with Bombers and A Little Too Close to God, and co-authored Shalom Friend, The Life and Legacy of Yitzhak Rabin. He previously edited the Jerusalem Post and the Jerusalem Report. David, thank you for doing this. I'm really grateful. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you, Avrum. Very interesting introduction. Good.
Yeah, I thought I'd give people a little bit of context because there's so much discussion out there about fake news. And while there is fake news out there, the truth of the matter is we should never undermine, not for a moment, what journalism and journalists do in order to ensure, that our society is as transparent. So with that introduction, David, do you see yourself as being part of a lofty industry, if you will?
I do think journalism is a noble cause, yeah. And I think it's facing many challenges, some of which you've referred to. But in its essence, if it's done the way it's supposed to be done, which among other, you mentioned some of the reasons, but broadly speaking, in democracies especially, I would say, we don't have time to run every aspect of our lives. So we put people in place to take the big decisions on our behalf because we're persuaded that they're the right people. We want to hold them to account. We want to make sure that they act honorably in our interest. We want to shine light where light needs to be shone. There's a lot of value for journalism that is telling stories that are gripping and dramatic and revelatory. But I think among the core values is making sure that the people who make huge decisions on our behalf at our request act honorably. And also, currently now, I'm sure we'll get onto this in the course of the conversation, but we're in a period generally where it's very hard to separate truth from manipulated content, shall we say, in the world of journalism. And we're also now in a historically not new fog of war, but we're in a war. I'm thinking especially, of course, of Israel fighting Hamas in Gaza, where you're looking at a stream of a largely unverifiable content coming out of an area where it's not safe for journalists to operate. And including journalists in Gaza, including Gazans. It's not safe for them to do honest journalism, and it's not safe for people who are not going to live there permanently to operate at all. And therefore, trying to make sense of even the most basic aspects of what is going on is, for me, I've been doing this for a long time. I don't remember a period where for almost a year and a half, one of the, if not the key story that we've been covering is a constant challenge when it simply comes down to things as basic as what happened, who says that happened, would we trust them, what are the other people saying, oh, they're not saying anything at all, what are we to make of this? And I think this is a huge challenge, largely is being failed. In some cases because it's very, very hard, but in other cases because people are forgetting about some journalistic basics, about checking who's making the claim and how credible are they, and what do we know, and how certain are we about it.
When you are writing an article or an analysis, or you're editing one of your journalist's pieces, you don't have a lot of time. In fact, prior to the interview starting here today, you said it's always crazy here. How does truth fit into that? How can you manage a moment whereby you look at a piece, you go, yeah, this feels good, I'm going to go with it, or you look at something, you go, I just don't know, man, I just don't know.
Yeah, okay, so it's a very deceptively simple question. I did indeed tell you before we started that it's always insane here. I mean, it wasn't always as insane as it is nowadays, but it's been pretty challenging for several years. I mean, we had a period, I think, of 5 elections in 4 years, and we thought that was pretty crazy for us in terms of strain. Then we had the immense contention of the current Israeli government's judicial overhaul plans. And we thought, wow, this is just, just in terms, never mind what you like or dislike, in terms of coverage and pace. And of course, then came October the 7th, which was, beyond catastrophic. And we really haven't stopped since in terms of the intensity. And I promise you, I'll answer your question in a second. We put out a daily edition every day at the Times of Israel, which is like, we don't have a print edition, we're only online. And once a day, we do a newsletter with the most important stories that we've run over the past 24 hours. So first of all, I'm being very candid with you, of course. In terms of the practicality of that newsletter, if you put too many items in it, it will cut off on various, like for Gmail, for example, cuts off after a certain length of an email. That's fine. It's not a problem. You can click and it will show you the whole thing. But it's stunning to me when at 5 o'clock Israel time, I'm just checking that email before it goes out. Material from, say, 20 hours earlier that we published. I mean, it is so yesterday's news. It is like, wow, that was only yesterday. Who's even thinking about that anymore? So the pace is incredible. And then, of course, there is the simple contradiction of wanting to be on the ball and publishing material in a timely fashion and wanting to be sure it's true. Or shall we say, the balance between speed and accuracy. And the faster you are, the more inaccuracies there are going to be. I mean, it was ever thus. It was, you'd close a print edition of your newspaper. People still do. Let's say at midnight, and at 10 past midnight, you discover that actually your lead story maybe is completely wrong, or there's an aspect to it that you didn't realize. And if only you could stop the presses. In the old days, some days you could. I'm sure there are newspapers with big enough print runs that they still can do that. But basically, there it is, impermanent. With all the fiascos that we know of, naming the wrong president after an election when the final vote wasn't in, etc. Right? All those. It's not as though all of a sudden there's this impossible contradiction between speed and accuracy. But in the internet era, with everybody weighing in, it's harder. And also, of course, again, as we've kind of mentioned, there are people actively disseminating misinformation deliberately, and there are people who are doing it, without meaning to. Yeah. I'll give you a little example of a story on The Wires a few weeks ago, which claimed The Wire. So in other words, maybe the second draft of history now, if we say social media is the first. But the news agencies are a very powerful driver of news. Most newspapers in the world subscribe to one or more of Reuters or AP or Agence France Presse, AFP. So one of the Wires put out a story saying that Hezbollah had blown up several Israeli tanks. I mean, I think day 2, maybe working in news in Israel, you would know that if several Israeli tanks were blown up, everybody in Israel would know about it, would be talking about it. It would be a huge story. There might be aspects of it that were censored by the military because they hadn't told, God forbid, the people who'd been killed. But, the idea that this would be a revelation, claimed by Hezbollah that Israel was not reporting, if you were working for the news agency, you would probably want to stop and check and think, maybe this isn't true. And do we know this is true? And should we trust Hezbollah? It ran on the wires, and it was not true, of course. And the Israeli army chose not to totally debunk it, although they told our correspondent that they were not aware of the incident, which was quite amusing because our correspondent had just told them that it was being reported. Anyway, so it's very difficult. It's very difficult. How do you grapple with that? You do your best. And if, you basically you edit and hopefully you report with one eyebrow raised up in sort of skeptical doubt. If it seems highly unlikely, well, maybe that's because it's not true. Have we checked this? Who's saying this? How likely is it? And by the way, sometimes, with the best of efforts and even a careful framework, you get stuff wrong. And when you get stuff wrong, you try to fix it and you correct it. I don't think we're perfect at the Science of Israel, for example, but we are trying to get to the truth rather than simply convey information that other people are asserting. And it's very challenging.
There's an old saying, the Israelis say that the world is so small you can put it inside of a pita. I would switch that a little bit and say that Israel is so small you can put it inside of one of those tiny little pitas. And with that knowledge, just the small aspect of Israel, and anyone who's visited there or lives there knows what that feels like. Does that play a role in terms of your reporting? As an example, metaphorically or otherwise, when you go to shul on the high holidays, people come up to you and go, now, David, you know what? I read your article and it was really inappropriate. The family down the street, whom you grew up with, how much of the community around you affects your writing?
Well, first of all, I think it informs our writing. The fact that it is a small country, and it informs, it's central to, I guess, the way Israel operates. And there are many aspects of this country that are amazing, and many of them in wonderful ways. Everybody does know everybody, and if they don't, they know somebody who knows everybody. Really, it's 2 degrees of separation at the most, I would think. In terms of distances, to digress, but it's kind of relevant as well for people who don't know. My wife's from Texas. Israel fits into Texas 32 times over. Right? This is we have something we laughably call the periphery in Israel. So the Gaza border, kibbutzim, and communities that were attacked on October the 7th, 2023, that's the periphery. So if you're from Texas, you would assume, well, the periphery, if I'm in Dallas, would require, a very, very, very long drive or a flight or something. Gaza is an hour and 15 minutes from where I am now in Jerusalem. Yeah. I think people don't recognize that. In terms of, you're very conscious that you're writing for people who you're going to run into in the street, but also because we're not, we're an English website primarily. We have a Hebrew site, we have an Arabic site and a Persian site and a French site as well, actually. But you're writing for an English-speaking audience. I think an overwhelming proportion of Israeli English speakers read us, so you know that. But you're also writing for people everywhere. I don't really want to schwitz about our traffic, but I will since you persuaded me. The traffic is extremely high, which is, in a way, it's gratifying that people have come to rely on us, but it's also a reflection of how difficult things have been for Israel in the last 16 months. I'd rather we had less traffic and the country was not in a enduring, multi-front conflict in the way that we are. You try to, you hopefully you wouldn't write differently about things because you realize this or that person might be unhappy about them, but you certainly are conscious that you're writing for people who are directly affected by the news that you're reporting. It's very real, the news here. The country has been, we were under terrible attack on October the 7th by people who want to keep doing it until they've destroyed the country, and who are supported by a state in Tehran, of course, that is overtly committed to destroying Israel and is seeking nuclear weapons. So you're conscious that the stakes are incredibly high in this little country with the people you love at the most direct, your family, and the people you care about, and a Jewish nation around the world who I think are utterly connected to Israel's fate, as I think the entire Jewish diaspora has internalized in the past 16 months. So it's a very serious proposition. I'll just say one other thing, which is a real digression from your question. As someone who grew up, I spent 20 years of my life in England, broadly speaking, and then the subsequent 2/3 I've been in Israel. It takes a long time to internalize some of the consequences of this being, our country. It includes the fact that when you're this is a little minor point. If you're going out to eat somewhere, I don't know how people in the rest of the world look at the serving staff in a restaurant, but you realize in Israel, these are my kids' friends, or they're my kids' friends, at at the most basic level. This is a country, by the way, where we don't talk about any of this, and you can shut me up anytime. Mm-hmm. Where I grew up in England, where they're incredibly polite in any interaction with bureaucracy, very polite, but no is no. They might be really polite about it, but if the answer is no, it can't be done. The rule says we can't do it. Forget about it.
Right.
This is a country where no is basically not yet yes. It's just a matter of finding the way to get to yes.
Are you brash? Have you grown into being a brash human being?
Well, I'll tell you guys. I'll tell you a little secret, which might be helpful for some people listening, which is extreme politeness is one of the ways to get to yes. Like it's so. I don't think it's the norm, shall we say, in all interactions with bureaucracy in Israel. So if you're really polite to people who are telling you no, that sometimes works as well. So I can be brash, but sometimes I'm very British. And all approaches ultimately work. I don't think you can really beat the army in some of its most essential rules and regulations. But most people in most environments, if you can explain to them why it really matters, even though the rule says that they shouldn't, they'll do it. You'll get there.
David, I was really fascinated by your background. I believe your great grandfather was a frum man, was a religious man who built a shul that was burnt down on Kristallnacht. In that light, what effect did your background have on you in terms of going into journalism?
Well, first of all, I didn't ask you to ask me that question, and it's a really lovely question. I appreciate being asked it.
Thank you.
On my father's side, my family were a rabbinical family for many generations. And indeed, my great-grandfather was, I think, the founder of the Burnerplatz Shul, which was in Frankfurt. His name was Rabbi Marcus Horovitz. He died in 1910, but in 1938, on Kristallnacht, indeed, the shul was burned down. His son, my late grandfather, was a lawyer, but a very Orthodox man as well. They were a very Orthodox and very German family, both of those things. It took them a long time, they're not unique in this in any way, to internalize that their beloved Germany was not going to get rid of the Nazis very quickly. And therefore they left in 1937, which was pushing it a bit, but reflected their reluctance. I think there would have been many reasons in retrospect where it was pretty obvious that there was no future for Jews in Nazi Germany. But they left in 1937. And I think it's central to everything that I did, that I do. In that my grandfather, the lawyer, the son of the rabbi, was nearly killed in World War I fighting in the German army. I think he was shot above the heart. I have at home the Iron Cross that he got for fighting for Germany in World War I, which is just a little stunning thing as far as I'm concerned, because it looks exactly the same as Iron Crosses looked like in World War II. So they fled to England. My father was one of 10 kids, and some of his brothers were interned when World War II broke out. His older brothers, they were deemed enemy aliens or potential because they'd come from Germany not too long before. Whereas my father was young enough not to be interned at the start of the war and old enough towards the end of the war, and he did some work in reconnaissance photography for the RAF. Analyzing reconnaissance photography and other things as well. So in the space of a generation, you have my grandfather nearly dying for Germany in World War I, and my father fighting against Nazi Germany in World War II. And for me, as I think is especially keenly felt maybe by people who grew up outside Israel or were born outside Israel, this miracle that in our lifetime, the Jewish people was able to revive its historic country and shape its destiny as best as a small country can. That was incredibly compelling. A country that had not finalized its borders, is grappling always with the balance between respect for the religion that sustained us in exile and the contours of a democracy, and wanting to be a majority Jewish state in a hostile neighborhood. I mean, all the complexities are, if you're doing journalism and you care about Israel and you care about the Jewish people, you kind of got to be here. So I went to journalism school, and then I started working. My first job was in East London. It was really an interesting local newspaper. It was a very interesting part of London where the Jewish community used to be, around Bethnal Green and Whitechapel, for anyone who knows that. They then moved to Northwest London and North London. But it was really interesting. But lots of my family were in Israel, and looking back, there was no doubt that I would come to Israel, and I came very soon after that.
David, during when 9/11 happened, I was the CEO of an organization I started called Via Havta, and it was Canadian Jewish Humanitarian Relief Committee. It exists to this day, and it's very vibrant. Thank God. And I remember the morning of watching on television the plane hit the first tower, and I was baffled. And my first response was, no, this couldn't be. Second response was, okay, wow, a small plane flew into the tower. Somebody made a huge mistake. And then as those moments continued, I realized, listen, I'm here with my staff, and it looks like a really dangerous day. And I cleared the staff out of the office. We walked blocks away, and I told them, everybody go home and come back when the time is right. I'll let you know. As a journalist, October 7th happens. It starts. And it's your responsibility to document what's going on, to write about it, to be on top of it. Was there a stutter step that you took before things kicked in? And once it kicked in, how did you deal with that day?
What does that mean, a stutter step?
I would imagine you look at it and you have a great responsibility as a journalist. And did you sit back with fear, and were you frozen for a moment, or did you dive right in?
Yeah. So we were in Tel Aviv over Shabbat, and we heard the rocket siren alerts, and that was pretty staggering. And to be, Tel Aviv and Jerusalem were not frequently targeted by rockets. It was not unheard of, but it was pretty stunning and a rude awakening. And then you turn on the television, and very soon afterwards, we saw video. I don't think it was live, but it had been sent to one of or more of the TV channels of the white Toyota pickup trucks on the streets of Sderot, on the largest city close to Gaza, and terrorists getting out with guns and running down the street. And I'm certain that there were a few seconds where you think, what is this? This can't actually be what. My eyes must be deceiving me. This is some kind of, I don't know. Not for very long, though, because at the same time, this is also Israel, and the rocket sirens had been wailing, and anything is possible. And then, indeed, I went straight away, sat up and started actually writing words. And I think my hands were shaking as I was trying to write those first words of describing what was going on. And I was in touch with the few people. It was a Shabbat morning who were working. We have a smaller staff on Shabbat. And went straight to work. And really, we as a team here, and it's not a big team, have been working nonstop ever since. And it remains, I don't know how you would describe 9/11. You spoke about it as something terrible had gone wrong, right? That was the words you used, or something like that just now. Mm-hmm. So this, for us in Israel, 16 months later, remains unfathomable, and I think will always remain unfathomable, because there are no adequate explanations for the willful refusal to believe the evidence that was available. And it's in that context. So it's spread to many fronts. Sometimes it contracts again, as I think it's fair to say in the last few weeks, especially where the focus has been on Gaza, and most especially on the ceasefire hostage Palestinian security prisoners deal. But that's not to say that other fronts will not re-emerge and other challenges will not re-emerge and so on. But it's an abidingly unfathomable starting point of the ongoing reality. And I mean, I can elaborate on that if you like, but the bottom line is that anybody watching this or listening to this with a modicum of common sense, privy to the information that the military and political leaderships had, would have acted more effectively than Israel's military and political leaderships acted in the weeks, days, and hours before the Hamas invasion, because you would have said, hey, there's all this evidence that they're training and planning and getting ready to attack, and they've been sending up drones to knock out cameras on the border and occasionally blowing things up against the fence. And they've made plain they've got these plans, and they've got 24 battalions, and we know who the head of the battalion is, and the number 2, we know where they are deployed, and we know they have this tunnel network. So even if the intelligence assessment is this is just bravado and they don't actually intend to do anything, just maybe we should have more troops at the border, because after all, the fence isn't designed. It's not that kind of a border fence. It's a sensor fence to tell you when people are approaching. It needs to be protected by troops. Let's send some more troops down. That's what anybody with that information would have said who wasn't imprisoned in this misconception. And why there was this refusal to consider that maybe this assessment was wrong is unfathomable. You can add answers. You can say, because the surveillance soldiers were women and it's a macho army and people higher up the chain didn't believe them. That's not a sufficient explanation. You could say that, you might want to say, well, the military chiefs are so remote from the periphery, but as we know, there is no periphery. And, there are grizzled soldiers who were responsible for that front, who live there, who spent their whole lives living there. The deputy head of Israel's Southern Command, his mother lives on Kibbutz Be'eri, or I should say lived on Kibbutz Be'eri, because she was killed on October the 7th at Kibbutz Be'eri, where he grabbed a gun and tried to kill some of the terrorists who'd invaded. So it was people who were intimately familiar with everything and yet insistently refused to believe the evidence before their eyes. So we're in an ongoing nightmare whose original failure, if you like, remains inexplicable to us.
Where do you put your fear? You've seen a lot, you've written a lot, you've interviewed a lot of people on the front lines. I'm sure you have family or friends who've been in Gaza. It's really important that you're able to write with a clear head and that you're able to operate from a lucid point. What do you do with your fear?
Okay, these again, such interesting questions you're asking. Generally, and it was the case for me more when I was younger. It allows you to distance yourself doing journalism. If you're, let me speak for myself. For me, it was helpful that I knew I had responsibility to my profession and what I tried to do. That even when terrible things were happening, so you're one step back and you're observing them and you're explaining them and you're writing about them and you're trying to do so fairly and honestly and constructively even. I must say that it's been harder than ever in the last 16 months. I wrote, as you mentioned at the very beginning there, I co-authored a book with other colleagues at the Jerusalem Report about Yitzhak Rabin. I was very affected by the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. But even that, on the day and afterwards, doing journalism was partly protective for me. It somehow made me a little bit more detached than I would have been. I'm so much older now, and I'm so utterly intertwined with the life of this country that it's hard to maintain that distance. But I do try nonetheless to write sanely and not emotionally. Sometimes, it's good to bring some emotion in, but to have a sense of how what I might be feeling is not necessarily representative of the entire country, and to understand where my emotions may differ from others. I think that's important. You do your best, but I don't think there's an Israeli in any walk of life who's not utterly affected by what's happening all around us, or there are very few. And I think for some people, it's better to not be completely obsessed about the news, for example. I think that's incredibly damaging for lots of people, maybe even for most people. What we try to do because of our profession, and it's not unique to journalism, there are people who need to know exactly what's going on. And it's not terribly healthy to be exposed constantly to every aspect of all the often terrible things that have been happening lately. And I try to say to the staff, we've tried to say it a lot, try and take a little bit of a break. And I really mean that, because I think it's bad for your psyche. But the fact is, of course, if you take too long of a break, then when you come back to doing your job, you'll not really understand what's happened since you were last obsessing, and you'll do your job less well. So there's a balance there. You do have to safeguard, protect your brain and your soul and your psyche, at the same time as somehow being completely up to speed and informed and working as hard as everybody, who's trying to do this well. And that's certainly our team here, working as hard as you can. It's complicated. And you've asked me a question there that really took me into places that I haven't been thinking about in quite that way. Yeah.
It's interesting what you're saying, because when you listen to NHL players, you know what the NHL is?
That much I do.
When you listen to them after a terrible loss, Toronto against Detroit, let's say, they'll say, you know what? It's finished. It's over. We're now moving on to the next game. Or to elite athletes will often speak that way. And by the way, you mentioned about it, it never hurts for your emotions to seep through. Your analysis recently on Donald Trump's idea to turn Gaza into the Riviera owned by Americans, that was steeped in emotion. And I was thinking about you, I have a very fertile imagination. I was thinking about you writing that. It was a really good piece. And I was thinking you were sitting there like, oh shit, man, really? I could feel your emotions in writing that.
So I don't know if you asked me a question, but I'll weigh in. Among the things that I felt and feel where that is concerned is it could have been presented. First of all, at the time that I was writing, he was adamant, and I'm not sure. Well, anyway, he was adamant at the time. He'd said the word permanently quite a few times. He was talking about the permanent evacuation of all Gazans. There's been a lot of wiggling. It's not entirely clear. I think Netanyahu over the weekend gave an interview in which he said Gazans would be able to come back. They'd be screened, or they'd be asked to forswear terrorism and words to that effect.
Yeah, that's what.
But I'm not sure if Trump had presented this differently. I mean, wouldn't have produced the same article from me. That's for sure. Gaza is, and Gazans, they're right next door, and boy, is that a complicated reality that we are facing. And some fresh ideas, by definition, are not necessarily terrible. There were things that could have been highlighted that would have made me feel very differently, and might have been much more beneficial if your goal is to get this to work, or some version of it. I'm not sure that there aren't ways to try and produce something constructive out of a fresh viewpoint, but the way it was presented, and including some of the very specifics about it, and there were, again, I'm being ridiculously candid here. There were things that I was considering including in that article from an Israeli perspective about people's attachment to a land and the casual dismissal of their attachment, which I didn't write because I didn't want people to assert that I was making any kind of comparison between Jewish rights to the Holy Land and anything else, basically. But I think that's in the mix as well. When somebody comes along and says, well, people can live better lives without necessarily being, I don't want to misquote something I actually did quote in the piece, but there were remarks to that effect. Those need to be troubling for people who believe that there is, as I do, historic legitimacy for the Jewish people in this part of the world. And I think we should be, very careful when people seem to suggest that it doesn't really matter so much if you've been living there or you care about that particular land. I think it can matter a great deal.
Just want to take a step back for a moment, because I'm fascinated with who you are as a person and the job that you do. I remember reading a number of years ago about a problem that existed in Sderot, that teachers who would be in class with their kids when a siren would go off, they had this incredible problem in front of them. They had to take care of their kids, but as parents, as many teachers are, they had to respond to the needs of their children as well. And I'm wondering, in terms of your work on October 7th and afterwards, the frenetic environment that you're involved in, where does your family fit in when the sirens go off, when the craziness really kicks in? How do you consider both what you need to do as a professional, as a journalist, and that you have your family?
So have we ever met before this conversation?
No, no, we haven't. No.
Okay, so you asked me if I would do this, and I said yes, and I have no idea that you're going to ask me any of these things, and I'm not complaining at all. I'm just, it's refreshing, and I commend you. And I don't know what you do in your other interviews, and I'm sure they're fascinating. I'm going to go and listen to some of them now.
Thank you, David.
So when things are not at the moment of chaos, I think, like any good parent, I would hope, you try and prepare. First of all, my kids are not terribly young anymore. They're still my kids, and I care about them every second. But they're around the late 20s, early 30s stage of life, so they're fairly sensible, maybe, and fairly responsible. And you try to give them, big life lessons, but you also try and tell them stuff that, because you may have more information to ensure that they make good choices and in the context that you're asking, so that they're safe, right? So when you're in the middle of an ongoing war, you try to tell them how seriously to take certain warnings, like when they're telling you that Iran's fired some drones, but you got 12 hours, or hey, they fired ballistic missiles and you got 12 minutes. That when the latter threat is being reported via the IDF spokesman, don't think that this is some kind of joke, and be very close to somewhere safe. And when you hear the alarms and you're told to go into the safe rooms or wherever you're told to go, do it. This is for real. So you try to prepare them ahead of time. When the division of responsibility, to be really personal, when actual potential life-threatening crisis erupt, is my wife worries about the kids. I worry about my wife, and basically I carry on working. And I don't know if that's good or bad, but that's the way it is. I have a relative here who's not in the best of health, an elderly relative. Tried to advise him. I don't even want to tell you guys my advice, because people listening in Israel should disregard it. But when you're very elderly and not terribly mobile, and there's a siren that appears to relate to a Houthi missile, for example, my advice, not my advice, the advice that was conveyed to this relative of mine was stay in bed and put a pillow over your head. Now that is emphatically not the official advice of the Home Front Command. But the point I'm making is, I try to bring any information that can be helpful to keep them safe, and I get on with my job.
Is your wife a tough Texan?
But she's going to listen to this, isn't she, Avrum? My wife is, stunningly fantastic person.
Yeah.
She's a tough Texan who's the daughter of a Holocaust survivor who was in camps throughout the war. Her mother is a third-generation Texan, and her father found himself by an endless series of extraordinary events able to survive the war, and found himself, thanks to some wonderful American Jewish soldiers, able to go to the States. And so my wife is a mix of all kinds of Texan and Polish, Jewish, Holocaust survivor genes, and pretty tough and capable. Yeah.
And a good cook?
And a good cook. Only good things.
Only good things. Good for you. Good for you.
Hey, you know what? It's very easy to say. It's the truth.
I've had the honor of interviewing some family members of hostages. I interviewed Yair Moses, whose father Gadi came out of Gaza in the tunnels only last week. A magnificent human being who told his captors at some point, as you know, when we find peace together with you, I will come back and teach you farming. Just a beautiful, beautiful soul. I also have done 2 interviews with Michael Levy, whose brother Orr came out yesterday. And I could not stop thinking about Michael and Yair. I could not stop thinking about their brother and their father. It was, and I woke up in the middle of the night and I texted Michael, saying, I'm thinking about you right now, and your work paid off. Your brother is home. In the back of my mind, Beinenu, David, between you and I never thought those 2 would come home. But my exposure to them made me so acutely sensitive to the hostages, to the hostage family. And it really has had such a deep, deep impact on my soul. I'm assuming you have met hostage families, members of the hostages. What sort of influence does that have on your writing, knowing these people?
Again, I don't think there's anyone in Israel who hasn't got a first or an immediate or second degree connection to hostages and families of hostages. I don't know any families of hostages at a deep personal level at all, but plenty of people who are very connected to me certainly do. We as a nation are widely obsessed with the hostages because these are lives that can still be saved. I don't think this is not what you're asking, but I think one of the reasons, among the aspects of what I call this enduring nightmare, is I don't think we've begun to internalize and mourn for the people who were killed on October the 7th. And then, of course, there are the hundreds of soldiers who've been killed since then. And I think it's natural and sensible and appropriate to focus on lives that can still be saved. I think we're all tremendously affected. And boys, this reality is as conflicting and wrenching as the monsters. I don't even like to use that word because they are people, Hamas, as they have designed it. This is, I don't think everything has played out as planned as far as they were concerned, but they certainly intended, they took these people, they stole these people from their homes, and murdered everybody around them as well, of course, with the goal of leveraging them to ensure that they would survive, that Hamas would survive, and then be able to do this again. And the complexity of getting them out, it's immense. The army was not able to rescue very many of them, and concluded, broadly speaking, that they would not be able to rescue most of them, and therefore there had to be a deal. We went through the Gilad Shalit deal in 2011, when 1,027 Palestinian security prisoners were released for one Israeli soldier who was abducted from within a base in Israel. You didn't really ask me about this, but it relates to your question. If the Prime Minister's objections to this deal very early on had been, I can't do this again. I can't release the vast numbers of people who I know are going to try and kill us all again. I can't do it. I don't think that would have been a good enough argument, given that the victims here are overwhelmingly civilians. The failure is so immense, of the breach of the basic covenant between a government and its people, of being able to, you can sleep safely in your homes in this country. That breach was so immense, and the army realized this. So I don't think that would have been a good enough argument. But it was striking to me that wasn't the key argument made by Netanyahu. And it does seem, and that's on the basis of public and some material that you hear as an editor in circumstances that you're not meant to attribute, it does seem that more could have been done more quickly. As the former defense minister Yoav Gallant said the other day, we could have got more hostages out more quickly and at a lower price. I don't think that is an absurd argument. I don't think that's an argument of a dismissed, unhappy muck thrower. I think there's a lot to that, and that makes it incredibly complicated as well, when a lot of the country thinks that there's an abiding failure, not just October 7th, an abiding failure where the hostages are concerned. I mean, we just, as you mentioned, we had people come out, including yesterday, and their condition. I mean, this was always going to become more harrowing as it went on, this deal, because it was meant to be children and civilian women first, and therefore from the get-go, when it wasn't the Bibas family, things were already terrible, and in a way that people were hesitant to state. And then when we're onto the men now, so obviously there are no more women and children who Hamas is claiming are alive. And by the way, the Israeli government, which did issue an ultimatum really for Arbel Yehud, because she was a civilian woman who hadn't been released ahead of civilian soldiers, it issued no ultimatum for the Bibas, for Shiri Bibas and her two sons. And we knew it was going to get more and more harrowing, because then you'd be on to the older men and men who are unwell. And yet this was presented as a great shock by the political leadership, and how, we didn't realize that their condition would be so dire. But of course we knew their condition would be so dire, and everybody in the security establishment has been warning about that. So I've digressed a long way, but it's the focus and attachment to, and appropriate degree to which the hostages dominate every day for many Israelis is utterly understandable and common to us all.
What were your feelings when you saw the totally emaciated state of the hostages that came out yesterday?
So initially, I mean, if you look at the way people reacted from the communities, at Be'eri, for example, as they were watching this, there was a very brief response of, wow, that's fantastic, here they are.
Yeah.
And then it was like, Ohad Ben Ami's mother, I think, said, oh my God, he looks, I didn't recognize him, he looks 10 years older. Yeah, I think several of the first degree relatives of those three who were released yesterday said words to that effect. Didn't recognize my father, said one of the daughters of Ohad. Eli Sharabi, it's heartbreaking to see. So it went from I mean, you're watching again these first, it's a little marginal thing, but this is, I don't know why it had to be on Shabbat, by the way. I don't know how that came to pass. So it's your Shabbat, which is, and lots of Israelis and who strictly observe Shabbat wouldn't have found out until last night what happened and the circumstances of how the releases were carried out and how people looked and so on. But it's a Shabbat morning, which is meant to be, a bit of a spiritual restful period. And there's this endless preparation for the ceremony, goes on for hours. There have been some of these exchanges, or some releases, to use the correct word, have been fairly brief, but some of them have been horror shows. And yesterday's wasn't the worst in terms of the ceremony, because when Gadi Moses came out with Arbel Yehud, as you know, it was awful. Like, you feared for their lives at that moment. You feared they were going to be torn apart by the crowds. Yesterday it was a regimented ceremony, but boy, was that a horror show with people with them being made to speak on stage. And when you start to understand, I think we'll know more about this and really what was going on in the next few days, perhaps. It was awful. It was further abuse by a monstrous terrorist organization, and it was awful to watch. It was awful to watch. With mixed with the joy or relief that 3 more lives have been saved, and then the despair of what they're going home to in some of their cases, right? Especially, it's not even like you get emotional even talking about it. Yes. Eli Sharabi and what he knew and when he knew and who he heard it from and what he's going through now. I mean, this is not the way human beings are meant to. It's not what human beings are meant to be faced with, and it's not a consequence of how human beings should not be acting to create these kinds of circumstances.
I was watching an Israeli speak yesterday on TikTok, I believe it was, and he said the hell that Was it Eli Sharabi who lost his wife and two teenagers? Am I correct with that?
He lost his wife and his two daughters, and his brother was killed in Gaza. Yeah.
It's like a Holocaust. And the Israeli, I remember he was crying and he was saying in hell or whatever he referred to it. And now he's going into another hell. And I thought he's exactly right. He's exactly right. This poor man. It's like our grandfathers coming out of Auschwitz and their entire family's gone, right? It's a terrible, terrible thing. I know that you are.
Just even talk. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you.
No,
even talking about it, you're intruding on somebody's terrible, terrible grief.
Yeah.
And yet we are all witnesses to it. It's it's a lowercase Holocaust. This is not a defenseless nation. He is not returning. It's not that he has nowhere to come back to. It is not that he is not surrounded by an entire nation that will do whatever it can at a I don't know about government, but at a civilian level, to help in any way. And in a government level, at least they'll say they want to. He is surrounded by a nation that cannot fix the essence, but will try to help.
Yes.
And that's why it's different. But at a personal level, for him, it's as terrible as any historical comparison you want to.
Yes, it's small H Holocaust, but it's large T trauma, right? I know that you're not. You have some qualms with Bibi, and you've often quoted him saying, "I fight on you." This is his mantra: "I fight on your behalf, and you fight me." Right? I am mesmerized as you are, and I just want you to comment on this: how it is that the Prime Minister of Israel has not stood up at some point over these last months and said, as you said in an interview, the buck stops here. I am responsible for what happened on October 7th, and there has to be an investigation into it. And whatever comes out of it, I will take full responsibility for it, and I will take what comes my way. How is it that he's not said that, David?
He's not. It's not that he hasn't come kind of close, but indeed he has not said, I will take full responsibility. And in fact, he's trying to arrange an investigation in which he thinks he will not be required to resign. A state commission of inquiry would likely recommend that he not continue in his post, and he doesn't want to set up a state commission of inquiry. And in the chaos of his the chaotic press conference, or the extraordinary press conference with Donald Trump, he had a throwaway line about they'll be surprised. I hope I'm right it was during that press conference that he said so. But certainly sometime in the last few days he said, we do need an inquiry. It needs to be an inquiry that is trusted by more than half the country, which was a reference to the judiciary, which he asserts half the country doesn't trust, and there'll be surprises when it reports. If you want to understand his psyche, I think he has convinced himself, but of course that's the convenient thing to convince yourself. I think he's convinced himself that he was failed by everyone around him on and before October the 7th. He said some of this, not all of it, that information was kept from him, and that that plays into his remark about people will be surprised when the truth comes out, etc. His people around him, including people very close to him, have basically blamed the military for everything and tried to blame the military for everything and the security services. That's not to say that completely vast amounts of blame attached to the security services, but at the political echelon and as prime minister, you have unique access to all the information, and the buck does stop with you. I think he's also convinced himself that nobody else will be able to enable Israel to recover. So that's what I think. I think he has long since, I don't think this is since October the 7th, I think he has long since convinced himself that he and the well-being of the state of Israel are inextricable, and that an Israel without him as prime minister would be lost. He thinks that his rivals are rise to the level of his ankles. By the way, I think the political opposition in Israel is extremely ineffectual, and I don't know how to run opposition politics or politics of any kind, but I don't think they're doing a very good job. And I think we should add in there that if he were incapacitated, and by the way, he's human and he has health issues, the immediate people who would be likely to succeed him are much less smart than he is and much less restrained than he is in terms of that part of the political spectrum. So, I just think people should be a little careful of what they wish for in some contexts. It's not as though without Netanyahu, everything would be great. And it's also, and this is really important, it's been one of the challenges for me that I've tried to focus on. You can have a country that is in a region where many forces are seeking to destroy it, with immense support internationally for the destruction of Israel and for Israel to be rendered defenseless and a misrepresentation of what Israel has been going through. And at the same time, you can have a leadership in Israel that is divisive and internally harmful and potentially deeply destructive. And both of those things are true at the same time. And that's one of the challenges that I've tried to focus on in the things that I write. There are terrible forces trying to destroy this country, and there are unthinkable degrees of support for these forces all over the world, including in the freest of nations, which I find unbelievable and horrific and despicable and insulting. When people, it's a TikTok meme, from the river to the sea, it says on my banner, which river, which sea. How can you not care what the slogan that you're advancing means? What does that say about intellectual rigor and integrity of anybody who's promoting a cause that they don't understand? I find that astounding. At the same time, we have a very problematic government. By the way, we also have a dysfunctional government. It's actually terrible at running the country in almost every field of ministerial responsibility. Since October the 7th, much of the most important revival has been carried out by civil groups. So all of that is true at the same time. And I do indeed have critical things to say about Netanyahu, but I'm not relentlessly critical of him. And there are plenty of things for which, he deserves support. But very few of them, I think, relatively speaking, in the last 16 months. And very few, especially, I would say, in this particular term of his government over the last 2 years.
David, I once met Yo-Yo Ma, the world-renowned celloist, at a restaurant here in Toronto. I used to do a restaurant and food show on the radio and TV. And I went up to him and I asked him a few questions, one of which was, what is the best time to do a concert, to play in a concert? And he said, good question. He goes, the best time to play in a concert is when you're half asleep, when you're really, really tired, because then your walls come down and the real music flows out of you. And the reason I say this to you is because I think it's about 5:00 in Israel now. It's Sunday. You're working hard, and you've been working hard for a long time. And I think that because of that, some of your answers today have been, as you qualified them, very candid, and I'm very grateful for your candidness. So I just want to thank you very much for this. In conclusion, I have two questions to ask you. One is from Gary Rosenblatt, who was the editor and publisher of the Jewish Week of New York, and the Baltimore Jewish Times. He's a lovely human being. He knows you. He sends his regards. He says you're a fair-minded, thoughtful, and caring journalist, and I think the Times of Israel is the best English language source of independent reporting on Israel. That's from Gary. His question to you is, I think it would be interesting to hear his views on the relationship between Israeli and American Jews in light of Trump's presidency, which is so threatening to U.S. democracy, at the same time that, as it seems for now at least, to be so supportive of Israel. I would think the gap is widening between the two Jewish communities. What are your thoughts on that?
So Gary's a clever man. And just responding to your comment, I've been quite candid because you've asked me questions that people don't tend to ask me. And so I try to be to answer you as best I could. And I am indeed pretty tired, but hopefully coherent. I do think it's a really important question, and I do think that it's very hard to answer. If you look at opinion polling in Israel, we would have voted in Israel for Trump by a greater margin than I think any state in the United States did on election day. And previously, like when he was running against Hillary Clinton, for example, it was his popularity, his preference here was far lower, and part of that was because he was he was an unknown quantity, whereas Hillary was a fairly known quantity. So I think Israelis then, 2 elections ago, were they thought that Trump might be quote unquote better for Israel, but they weren't sure, and they felt that with Hillary they'd know where they were. This time, Israelis did know what they thought they would get from Trump, and it's mainstream Israeli supported policy to have Israeli sovereignty on the Golan Heights and for Jerusalem to be recognized as our capital. And he, as he said just the other day, he didn't just recognize Jerusalem, he built an embassy here. And there it is, just down the road from where I live. So Israelis, when this election came around, were incredibly supportive. And we know, of course, that American Jewry, first of all, in any case, for a long, long time, has been overwhelmingly supportive of the Democratic presidential candidate. And I don't think it was significantly different this time at all. And there are different challenges and different stakes. And I think it's natural where, our priority ultimately is survival. American Jewry, I think, has different survival issues now. They're not the risk of being invaded by enemy forces who are going to slaughter you, but in terms of their sense of Jewish security and the capacity to live proud and public Jewish lives and anti-Semitism and so on. There are different core issues here. I think if you asked Israelis, if you were in America and these were the policies offered by the different candidates, and yet take Israel out of the equation, I think the preferences would be very different. And I think if American Jews were being asked, to make a choice on the basis of core Israeli interests, again, the proportions and the support and the mindset would be different. It reflects, I think both communities are in crisis. I really do. I don't know how severe it is in the United States, and I'm thinking about the rise of anti-Semitism since October the 7th, which I find staggering, and which I assume everybody watching and listening to this recognizes is not quote unquote anti-Israel or mere quote unquote anti-Israel. It is wider. When your obsession is with the world's only Jewish state, and when you are trying to get it wiped out, as some people, at least at the protests, are, you're into anti-Semitism territory. So I think it's a natural consequence of the particular nature of the key concerns, and I think there is therefore a reality in which there are very different takes and a diverging priority agenda, if you like, right? And that's what you're seeing.
In conclusion, my dear friend Eli Rubenstein, who's Director of Education at International March of the Living, and he's the senior spiritual leader here in Toronto at Congregation Abonim, and he's a beautiful human being. He asks as follows: on the spectrum of opinions of Israel, there are two extremes ranging from 1 to 10. Those who would give Israel a number 1 rating are Israel's most ardent supporters. They claim that Israel has the most moral army in the world and conducted the war in Gaza perfectly, without the loss of a single unnecessary innocent civilian life. Israel's record is as perfect that can be compared to any other nation under those circumstances. Those who would give Israel a number 10 rating on the spectrum believe Israel is the most evil regime to ever exist, that Israel is a bunch of pseudo-Nazis bent on exterminating and annihilating every last Palestinian living in the Gaza Strip and elsewhere, and are well on their way to doing just that. His question to you is essentially, I won't read the rest. He can be verbose, and I love the man. He goes, his question is, where do you stand on this, David, between the 1 and the 10?
Yeah, okay. I don't want to be on that. I don't want to be making judgments on that on a scale. We have no place on that scale, at the anywhere near the most evil nation on earth. It's outrageous and absurd and unthinkable, and nobody with any kind of moral clarity can believe that. And I want to say period, full stop. Take a deep breath, and now I'm going somewhere else. And the somewhere else is Israel's not perfect. Broadly speaking, I'd like to think that it does its best in many areas. Where I worry a great deal, and again, being uncharacteristically candid in something that I'm not writing and poring over many times. I think that Judaism. I mean, we always note the fact that Judaism has survived through all these millennia, including most periods when there was no territory, no state. So it survived as a faith and a code of life. And we marvel at the mini miracle, or the miracle of Jewish survival. And why did we survive? We survived around a faith and a code of life. And as I'm not saying anything original here, but Hillel, when asked by a would-be convert to sum up Judaism, treat others as you would wish to be treated, right? I think that if you believe that we were chosen, it was not as some kind of special people elevated among others and therefore empowered by God to treat other people with less respect or in ways that we would not wish to be treated. I think we were blessed with a framework for living in which we treat others as we would wish to be treated. And it's our responsibility. That's what comes with the blessing, to try and be a light unto the nations in that respect, to treat people, to sanctify life and show respect for life, right? We're really at that most basic level. And my concerns for Israel, many of my concerns for Israel, are that many people seem to have, to my mind, and again, disagree with me by all means, forgotten what the essence of Judaism is all about. And by the way, I think that there is a lot that the diaspora could help, and I think there are a lot of Orthodox and wise people out of Orthodoxy who need to do more to champion and remind people what Judaism is about at its heart. And that would only benefit mankind, is the humankind, is the ultimate goal, but it would certainly benefit Israel, which many of its internal problems, I think, would be helped and maybe even solved if we reminded ourselves it's not about ritual. It's not about ritual might be protective and it might be wonderful in terms of community and of ensuring that the core is protected, but the core is sanctify life and treat people the way you would wish to be treated. It is, and again, just to hammer this home, it is not about failing to share the burden. It is not about failing to provide for your family. No, Orthodox Judaism is pretty adamant about your responsibility to share the burden and to provide for your family. And we've been given this incredible brain. And why would you limit the areas in which you educate people and the access to the wonders of the human mind in all of its variety over the millennia? So there, I think, is cause for concern and scope for people to advance and highlight and remind us of core Jewish values.
David, I've been playing around with AI for the last few months, and it's my tradition now to ask AI to print up a poem of my guests. So here we have for you an ode to David Horovitz, and it goes as follows. This is from AI. David Horovitz, with a pen in hand, a voice that echoes through the promised land. He shaped the stories bold and clear of Israel's dreams, its hopes, its fears. A founding force, a guide so true, the times of Israel grew and flew. Through history's pages, his words did dance, a steadfast vision, a bold advance. In the world of news, he carved his place with integrity and unmatched grace. He penned the truth through dark and light, a beacon burning ever so bright. Through conflicts and triumphs, he stood strong, with every headline a purposeful song. His legacy lives in the stories told of a nation's heart, both young and old. David Horovitz, the founder and guide, in the pages of history, his name will reside. For in the times of Israel, his vision remains, a legacy built like timeless plains. There you go. An ode to
What should I say to that?
whatever you want.
Well, it's ridiculously embarrassing and almost certainly not true, and reminds us why we should be wary of AI. I'll go with that.
Okay, fair enough. Good response. Bob Ray, the Canada's United Ambassador to the United Nations, had a similar response. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank everybody for watching and for listening. And as I ask at the end of my podcast, I ask each and every one of you to take something out of this discussion, out of this schmooze, that can benefit you in terms of finding your zone. David is clearly a man who has worked arduously over the years to be a great journalist, to start up a newspaper with an incredible reputation. And he does so, I'm sure, much to the chagrin of those who love him, because the hours involved in this are huge. I know, because I was a journalist. And I think I still am through my podcast. But you know what? The idea is to find your passion. It's to find the thing you love, right? And when you do, you will find the purpose and meaning in life that will allow you to move forward in a happy way, in a satisfied way. It's like Viktor Frankl said, through logotherapy, the idea is to find that gift that you have lying within you, and to nurture it and to grow it and to shape it. And that in itself will make you a stronger, better human being, and make the world in which we live a better place, and certainly as Jews, a stronger people. So David, thank you for your inspiration. I'm very, very grateful for your time. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
So Avrum, you're a very good interviewer. I couldn't do anything at the Times of Israel without the team here. It's just wouldn't last a minute. Thank you very much. This was somewhat embarrassing towards the end, so you should probably cut all those nice bits off at the end. Okay.
I'll consider it. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again. Zeigazin, as they say in Yiddish, which is go in health. Das Vidanya, Wiedersehen, be well, until we meet again.